My name is Amara Osei. I am 24 years old. My father looked me in the eyes, slid a stack of legal papers across his desk, and told me that if I did not marry the man he had chosen, he would erase me from everything: his will, his name, his world. I stood there in silence. My hands were cold. My chest felt like something heavy had been placed on top of it and left there. I thought I knew my father. I thought I understood what kind of man he was. But that afternoon in his office, I began to realize I had never really known him at all. Before I tell you what I did at that wedding, before I tell you what I said into that microphone in front of 300 guests, tell me something. Have you ever sat across from someone who was supposed to love you, and felt like you were looking at a stranger? If you have, stay with me. Because this story is not just about a wedding. It is about a lie that had been buried for years, a person who was sacrificed to protect two powerful men, and the moment I decided that the truth was worth more than anything my father had ever offered me. The office smelled like cedar and money, the way it always did. My father, Amara Osei, sat behind his desk like a man who had never once doubted himself. The leather chair, the heavy curtains, the framed photographs on the wall, everything in that room was designed to remind you that he was in control. I had been called in after dinner, which was never a good sign. Amara did not do casual conversations. Every meeting had a purpose. I sat down slowly and folded my hands in my lap, trying to look calm even though something in my stomach was already pulling tight. He did not waste time. He told me directly that Julian Roche was the man I would marry. Not suggested. Not requested. Told. His voice was even and unhurried, the way it got when he had already made up his mind and was simply informing you of a decision that had been made without you. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could form a single word, he slid a folder across the desk. Inside were legal documents. My name was at the top. I recognized the language immediately. It was a formal removal from his estate. Everything. The accounts, the properties, the shares in Osei Holdings. All of it, prepared in advance. He had not waited to see what I would say. He had already assumed I would resist, and he had come ready. My voice shook when I finally spoke. His never did. I stared at those papers for a long time. Not because I was reading them carefully. I knew what they said. I stared because I was trying to understand what kind of father prepares documents to cut his daughter out of his life before she has even said no. That was the part one could not move past. He had not threatened me and then gone to prepare papers. He had prepared the papers first. That meant the threat had been planned. That meant this conversation had been scheduled in his mind long before he called me into that office. I had always known Amara was a strategic man. He ran one of the most respected holding companies in the country. Every decision he made was calculated. But I had believed, somewhere deep and foolish in my heart, that I was the exception. That with me, he led with love first and strategy second. That folder told me I was wrong. I thought about walking out. I thought about standing up, pushing the folder back across the desk, and leaving without a word. But I knew what that would cost me. Not just financially. Amara's name was attached to everything I had built in my career so far. Every door I had walked through had his fingerprints on the handle. If he pulled his support, those doors would close. I was not ready to face that. Not yet. So I did the thing that felt most like survival in that moment. I told him yes. My voice was quiet. Almost a whisper. He nodded once, like I had confirmed something he already knew. I met Julian Roche 3 days later at a restaurant near the financial district. It was the kind of place that had no prices on the menu, where the waiters wore jackets and spoke in low voices. Amara had arranged it, of course. He arranged everything. Julian was already seated when I arrived. He stood when he saw me, which I noticed, and extended his hand in a way that was polite but careful, like someone who had been coached on how this meeting should go. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of face that looked comfortable in expensive rooms. His family, the Roches, ran an investment group that had been operating in West Africa and Europe for decades. On paper, we made sense. That was the problem. Everything about Julian felt like something that had been arranged on paper. We sat down. We talked. He asked me questions about my work, my interests. I answered. He answered mine. It was civilized and completely hollow. And then, somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, he set down his fork and looked at me directly for the first time. He said, quietly enough that only I could hear, that this arrangement was not really his choice either. He did not elaborate. He did not explain. He just looked at me with something behind his eyes that I could not name yet, something that sat between guilt and warning, and then he picked up his fork again and the conversation moved on. I drove home that night with his words looping in my mind. The first family dinner happened 2 weeks later. Both families, together. Henri sat at the head of the table as if he owned the restaurant, which, I later found out, he did. Julien's father, Marcus Roche, sat across from him. They were two men who clearly knew each other well. Too well, in the way that people who have shared something difficult know each other. There was a particular kind of familiarity between them that had nothing to do with warmth. They barely looked at each other directly. They spoke in half sentences, finishing thoughts that seemed to already exist between them. Julien's mother, Vivienne, made polite conversation with me while her eyes kept drifting to her husband. I watched all of it carefully. And then Marcus Roche said something that stopped me. He was talking about the wedding timeline, about how important it was to move quickly, and he said, almost to himself, almost too quietly, that this marriage would finally fix things. Fix things. I looked at Henri. His face did not change. He just lifted his glass and drank. But I saw it. The small, almost invisible tightening at the corner of his jaw. He had heard it too. And he did not want to hear it said out loud. I did not confront my father after that dinner. I had learned, growing up in Amara Osei's house, that confrontation without evidence was just noise to him. He would dismiss it, reframe it, or simply go quiet in the way powerful people go quiet when they want you to feel small. So instead of asking questions, I started looking for answers on my own. I had access to business databases through my work as a financial analyst. I knew how to read company records, ownership structures, and filing histories. I started pulling documents connected to Osei Holdings and the Roche Group, going back as far as the records went. Most of it was what I expected, clean, structured, predictable. But then I found something that did not fit. Buried in a set of filings from 11 years ago was the record of a company called Trident Continental Group. It was listed as a joint venture. 2 founding shareholders appeared on the original documents. One was Amara Osei. The other was Marcus Roche. The company had existed for 4 years. Then, abruptly, the filings stopped. No formal closure notice. No restructuring announcement. No press release. It had simply disappeared from the record, the way things only disappear when someone with resources decides they should not be found. I pulled every document connected to Trident Continental Group that I could find. It took 3 evenings. I made notes, cross-referenced dates, built a timeline on paper spread across my apartment floor. The company had been formed when I was 13 years old. It had operated for 4 years, handling large infrastructure investments across 3 countries. The revenue figures in its early filings were significant. Whatever Trident was doing, it was not small. And then, in the 4th year, everything changed. The filings became sparse. Then they stopped. The company was quietly dissolved. But what caught my attention more than the disappearance was the timing. 11 years ago, there had been a financial scandal connected to a government infrastructure contract in one of the countries where Trident operated. I remembered it vaguely from the news, though I had only been a teenager at the time. A company had been accused of routing government funds improperly. There had been an investigation. There had been a name attached to it, a name that took the blame publicly while the bigger players faded quietly into the background. I did not have that name yet. But the timeline was too clean to be a coincidence. Trident Continental Group had dissolved within 2 months of that scandal breaking. My father and Marcus Roche had walked away without a scratch. It took me another week to find someone who had worked at Trident Continental Group. Her name was Cora, and she had been a mid-level accounts manager during the company's final year. She agreed to speak with me only on the condition that I never use her full name or identify her employer. We met at a coffee shop far from the financial district, in a neighborhood where neither of our faces would be recognized. Cora was careful. She chose her words the way someone does when they have been scared into silence before. But she talked. She told me that in Trident's final months, the pressure from above had been intense. There were instructions coming from the founding shareholders, instructions to move funds in ways that did not follow standard procedure. When the investigation began, someone had been put forward to answer for it. A financial officer. He had been named in the official report as the architect of the misconduct. He had lost his career, his reputation, and eventually his legal case. Cora leaned forward and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had not been the architect of anything. He had followed orders. The orders had come from above him. And the two men above him had made sure the trail stopped at his name. She left the coffee shop before I finished my tea. The engagement was announced on a Thursday morning. Henri had arranged a press release through Osei Holdings' communications team. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 business publications and a lifestyle magazine. The headline on one of them read, "Two Pillars of Industry Unite, Osei and Roche Families Announce Alliance." The comments were warm and congratulatory. Old friends and business associates posted their approval. People sent flowers to my mother's house, where I had spent the weekend. My phone filled with messages from cousins, colleagues, and people I barely knew, all saying the same kind things. I read every message with a feeling I could not quite describe. It was not happiness. It was not exactly dread either. It was something closer to the sensation of standing on a stage in a play you did not audition for, delivering lines someone else wrote, while the audience applauded a character who did not exist. Julian's family released a matching statement from the Roche group. The timing was coordinated. Henri and Marcus had clearly planned this together. The public announcement was not just news. It was a lock. It told the world this was happening, which made it significantly harder to undo without consequences. I understood what Henri was doing. He was using public perception as a wall around me. He had spent 30 years learning how to use other people's eyes as a tool. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, I found the transfers. I had been digging through financial records connected to Trident Continental's dissolution, following the trail of what happened to the company's remaining assets after it closed. Most of it was clean, debt settled, contracts terminated, assets distributed. But there was one thread that did not end cleanly. A set of recurring transfers, modest in size but consistent, had continued flowing after Trident's closure. They came from a holding structure that had technically replaced Trident on paper, a shell, essentially, with a different name and a single listed director who turned out to be a legal representative, not a real operator. The transfers went into accounts connected to the Roche Group. Not Henri's accounts. Not Osei Holdings. The Roche side. That was the first thing that surprised me. The second was the frequency. They had continued for years. Quietly. Routinely. Like a payment that everyone involved had agreed to forget existed. I sat with that information for a long time. I did not yet understand exactly what it meant. But I understood enough to know that the relationship between my father and Marcus Roche was not just a business friendship. It was something older, more tangled, and more dangerous than I had imagined. And whatever it was, it had survived for over a decade. I tried to talk to Julian again. I asked him to meet me, not at a family dinner, not at an event arranged by our fathers, but privately. Just the two of us. He agreed without much hesitation, which surprised me. We met at a small park near his apartment building on a quiet afternoon. He sat across from me on a bench with his hands clasped together, looking at the ground more than at me. I told him I had been doing research. I told him I had found Trident Continental Group. I watched his face when I said the name. Something moved across it quickly, like a shadow crossing a wall. He did not look shocked. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a particular knock on a particular door and had finally heard it. I asked him what he knew. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up and said, in a steady voice, that I did not know how far this went. He said it the same way someone warns you away from an edge they have already stood too close to. He said the people involved were not the kind to accept exposure quietly. I asked him directly if he knew why our fathers wanted this marriage. He pressed his lips together. Then, instead of answering, he stood up. He said only that I should be careful. And then he walked away, hands in his pockets, without looking back. Henri called me to his office again on a Tuesday afternoon. This time, the tone was different, not a confrontation, not quite. He was reminding me of what was at stake. He did it the way he did most things, calmly, pleasantly, as if he was simply having a conversation. He talked about the wedding plans. He talked about the venue, the guest list, the catering company he had hired. He spoke about the future, what my life would look like as part of two connected families, the opportunities it would open, the stability it would create. He spoke for a long time without saying anything that sounded like a threat. And then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had already made some adjustments to my accounts. A test, he called it. To see how things would look on the other side of certain decisions. I checked my phone after I left his office. He had removed my access to a supplementary account he had maintained for me since I started working. It was not my main income. But it was significant. He had done it that morning, before I arrived. Not after. Before. He wanted me to know he had acted already, not that he was planning to. The message was simple and precise. This is not a warning about the future. This is a demonstration of the present. He was showing me, again, that he moved first. I sat in my car outside Henri's building for a long time after that meeting. The city moved around me, taxis, pedestrians, delivery vans, and I sat completely still with my hands in my lap and thought about walking away. I thought about it seriously, more seriously than I had allowed myself to before. I could leave the country. I had savings of my own, separate from anything Henri controlled. I had skills, a professional record, references that had nothing to do with the Osei name. I could build something elsewhere. People had built things with less. I sat with that option for a long time, turning it over, testing its weight. And then I thought about Cora. About the man whose name she would not say out loud, sitting in a coffee shop with her hands wrapped around her cup, eyes on the door. About the financial officer who had taken the blame for something he did not engineer. About the years he had spent carrying a weight that did not belong to him. If I left now, the truth left with me. Whatever I had found, whatever was still buried in those records, would stay buried. Henri and Marcus Roche would finish what they had started. The marriage would happen with someone else if not me, or the deal would simply be restructured in another form. And the man who had taken the fall would remain the only name anyone remembered in connection with a scandal he had not created. I could not do it. I decided, sitting in that car with the city flowing past, that I was going through with the wedding. But I was going through with it on my own terms. I had 6 weeks before the wedding date. I used every day of them. During the hours I was supposed to be reviewing venue arrangements and meeting with the wedding planner Henri had hired, I was building a file. I printed documents, organized them by date, cross-referenced names. I created a clean timeline on a spreadsheet, Trident's founding, its operating years, the scandal, the dissolution, the ongoing transfers. I labeled every document with a source. I made 2 copies of everything and stored them separately. I worked carefully and quietly, the way my father had taught me, without knowing he was teaching me. He had always said that preparation was the only form of power that could not be taken away from you. I was beginning to understand what he meant, though not the way he had intended. As the weeks passed, a pattern in the documents became impossible to ignore. The official investigation into the infrastructure scandal had concluded that one man was responsible. His name was in the final report. His license had been revoked. But the documents I had assembled told a different story. The instructions that had led to the misconduct had been issued from above him, documented in internal communications I had obtained through a contact at a regulatory archive. Those communications had not been included in the official report. They had been withheld. I found his name on a cold Wednesday night, just after 11 o'clock, sitting at my kitchen table with documents spread around my laptop. The financial officer who had taken the blame was named Thomas Acquah. I did not recognize the name at first. I wrote it down and stared at it. Thomas Acquah. I searched his name in connection with the scandal and found old news articles. There was a photograph, a man in his 40s, serious-faced, professional. The articles described him as a mid-level executive who had orchestrated fraudulent fund movements and cost the government millions. He had been convicted in a civil case, stripped of his credentials, and financially ruined. His appeals had been denied. Then I searched his name outside of the scandal. And I found something that made the room feel very quiet. Thomas Acquah had once worked at Osei Holdings. Not at Trident. At Osei Holdings directly. He had been employed there for 6 years before being seconded to Trident Continental Group at its founding. He had left Trident, or been removed from it, 8 months before the scandal broke. He had then been named as the sole responsible party. A man my father had employed, transferred, and then, it appeared, abandoned to carry the weight of something much larger than himself. I did not sleep much that night. I sat with what I had found and felt it rearrange everything inside me, slowly, the way an earthquake moves through ground before the surface breaks. Thomas Acquah had not been a stranger caught in the crossfire of a corporate dispute. He had been UNRI's employee. He had been brought into Trident by UNRI. He had done what he was told by men above him, men who then used his name to close a chapter they needed to close quickly. I had grown up hearing my father speak about integrity, about the importance of loyalty, of taking responsibility, of building things that last. He said those things at dinner tables and in speeches and in interviews. He had said them to me directly, many times, in that same calm voice he used when he wanted something to land with weight. And all of that time, a man named Thomas Acquah had been living with a ruined career and a court judgment against his name, carrying the consequences of decisions he had not made. I thought about what it means to sacrifice someone. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, practical, corporate way, the way UNRI did most things. The way you simply make sure the trail ends at a name that is not yours, and then you walk back into your life and pour your energy into the next thing, and you never think about it again because thinking about it would cost you something, and you have decided the cost is not worth paying. The final confirmation came from an unexpected place. A former regulatory official had written a detailed private memo 8 years after the investigation closed, documenting his concerns about evidence that had not been properly reviewed. That memo had been filed internally and never acted upon, but it existed in an archive. My contact sent it to me on a Friday afternoon. I read it twice. The memo named both Amara Osei and Marcus Roche directly. It stated that internal communications from Trident Continental Group, which had been submitted to the investigation but not included in the final report, contained instructions issued by both founding shareholders that directly contradicted the narrative of a rogue financial officer acting alone. The memo had been filed, reviewed, and then quietly set aside. Someone, somewhere, had made a decision that the memo did not need to go further. I did not know who that person was or what they had been offered. But I had the memo. I had the internal communications it referenced. I had the timeline, the transfer records, and Cora's account. I had the photograph of Thomas Acquah from a newspaper article, next to an article from 6 years earlier listing him as a senior employee of Osei Holdings. It was complete. Both men were implicated equally. The marriage between Julian and me was not about love or alliance or legacy. It was about 2 men who shared a secret, making sure they stayed close enough to keep it buried together. The wedding was on a Saturday in April. The venue was a private estate outside the city, the kind of place that took a year to book and cost more per hour than most people made in a month. 300 guests had been invited. The list had been assembled by UNRI, approved by Marcus, and reviewed by both families' communications teams. It included politicians, business leaders, journalists from lifestyle and finance publications, and a small number of people who seemed to be there simply because their presence added prestige. I arrived in the bridal suite at 9 in the morning. I let the stylists do their work. I sat in the chair and watched my reflection in the mirror and felt something very calm settle over me. Not peace, exactly. Something more like the feeling of having made a decision so completely that there is no longer any weight attached to it. The uncertainty was gone. What replaced it was focus. I had a folder in my overnight bag, sealed, containing printed copies of every key document. I had sent digital copies to 2 people I trusted the previous night, with instructions to hold them until they heard from me. I had also arranged for the venue's presentation screen, which was meant to display a photo slideshow during the reception, to be connected to a laptop that I controlled. The technician had been told it was a surprise element for the reception. He had smiled and set it up without questions. The ceremony began at 2 in the afternoon. The officiant was a family friend of Unri's, a dignified older man with a warm voice who had performed dozens of high society weddings. The guests were seated. The music played. I walked down the aisle on my uncle's arm. Unri had offered to walk me, and I had declined, saying I wanted my uncle to have the moment. Unri had accepted this without reading it as anything other than sentiment. I walked slowly. I looked at the guests' faces as I passed. Politicians who owed Unri favors. Journalists who had published flattering profiles of Osei Holdings. Business partners who had built careers in his orbit. Marcus Roche sat in the front row beside Vivienne, his face composed and satisfied. Unri stood just behind the officiant, watching me approach with the expression of a man overseeing the completion of a project. Julian stood at the altar. He looked at me as I walked toward him, and in his eyes I saw something I recognized from the park bench. He knew something was about to happen. He did not know exactly what. But the guilt behind his eyes told me he was not entirely sorry. The officiant began. The room was silent and still. And then, just before the exchange of vows, I raised my hand gently and said that I had something I would like to say first. The room shifted immediately. A few people smiled, assuming it was something tender, a personal vow addition, a surprise reading. The officiant stepped back slightly and gestured for me to proceed with a gracious nod. I turned to face the guests. All 300 of them. I did not hold notes. I had rehearsed what I needed to say enough times that the words were simply there, ready, steady. I spoke clearly, without raising my voice, because I had learned from the best that calm carried further than volume. I said that I was grateful to everyone who had come. I said that a wedding should be built on truth, and that I felt it was important, before making a lifelong promise, to be honest about what had brought us all to this room. I said that this marriage had not grown from love alone. That it had been arranged to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with Julian or me. I said that 2 families had built something together years ago, and that something had gone wrong, and that the consequences of that had been placed on a man who did not deserve to carry them. I heard a chair shift. I did not look toward Unri. I kept my eyes on the guests. Unri's voice came from behind me, quiet and firm, saying my name. Just my name. The way he said it when he wanted me to stop. The room was already listening. They had heard me. And they were not going to stop. I had arranged a signal with the technician in the back of the room. When I nodded once in the direction of the presentation screen, he switched the input. The photo slideshow, which had been showing soft images of Julian and me, disappeared. In its place appeared the first document. It was the original Trident Continental Group founding registration, with both names clearly visible. Amara Osei. Marcus Roche. I heard the murmur begin immediately, the sound of 300 people reading at the same time. Then the second slide appeared. It was the timeline I had built, Trident's founding, operating years, the scandal, the dissolution. Clean, factual, dated. Then the internal communications. The instructions issued to Thomas Acquah, signed and dated, showing the directives had come from above. Then the regulatory official's private memo, naming both men. Each slide was on the screen for 30 seconds before the next appeared. I did not narrate them. I let the guests read. The murmur in the room grew with each slide. I heard someone near the front say the name Trident out loud. I heard a journalist 2 rows back pull out her phone. Marcus Roche had stood up. Unri had moved toward me, stopped just short, and stood very still. The room had changed completely. The controlled, elegant atmosphere Unri had spent months constructing was cracking open, quietly but permanently, in front of the people whose opinion he valued most. Then Julian spoke. He had not moved from the altar. He had watched every slide appear on the screen. And when the final document had been displayed, he turned to face the guests, and he said, in a voice that was quiet but clear enough for the room to hear, that everything I had shown was accurate. He said that he had known about Trident for years. That his father had told him pieces of it over time, never the full picture, but enough that he had understood the marriage was meant to tie the two families together in a way that made it harder for either side to expose the other. He said he had not wanted to go through with it. He said he had tried to find another way and had not been able to, until I had walked into that park and said the name Trident out loud. He looked at me then, not with love, but with something that felt like genuine respect. He said that I had done what he could not do alone. The room was absolutely silent while he spoke. Marcus Roche said his son's name once, sharply. Julian did not look at him. Henri had not spoken since he said my name. I turned and looked at him for the first time since I had begun speaking. He was not angry. That was the thing I had not expected. He looked afraid. Amara Osei had stood in front of audiences his entire professional life. Board meetings, press events, government hearings. He had always been the calmest person in the room. It was his greatest skill, and he wore it like armor. But standing in that venue, with 300 guests reading documents that connected his name to a buried scandal and a ruined man, the armor was gone. I watched it leave his face. Not quickly, not dramatically. It drained away, slowly, the way color leaves something left in the sun too long. Marcus Roche was speaking in a low, urgent voice to his legal representative, who had been seated in the third row. Vivienne Roche had her hand over her mouth. Several guests near the front were already on their phones. The journalist I had noticed earlier was typing fast. The officiant had stepped quietly to the side and was saying nothing, which, I thought, was the most honest thing anyone in his position could have done. Two of Henri's closest business allies, men who had arrived that afternoon with warm handshakes and louder laughs, were now leaning toward each other, saying things I could not hear. Henri looked at me from across the space between us. In his eyes, behind the fear, I saw something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. As if, in this moment, he was seeing me clearly for the first time. I had thought, during the weeks of preparation, about how far I wanted to go. I had the documents. I had the memo. I had enough to take everything further, to pass the evidence formally to a regulatory body, to give it to the journalist sitting in the third row, to speak to lawyers about reopening the case against Thomas Acquoy. I could have done all of that from the altar. I could have named every name, traced every transfer, laid out the full architecture of what Henri and Marcus had built and what they had used to hide it. I had prepared for that possibility. But standing there, looking at my father's face, I made a different choice. Not out of love, exactly. Not even out of mercy. I made it because I had already done what I came to do. The truth was in the room. 300 people had read the documents. The journalist was typing. The guests who mattered most to Henri, the people whose respect he had spent a lifetime earning, had seen his name beside evidence that could not be unread. I did not need to destroy him in order for the truth to stand. Destruction would have made this about my anger. I did not want it to be about my anger. I wanted it to be about Thomas Acquoy. So I said, simply, to the room, the person this wrong was done to deserves to have his record corrected. That was all. That was enough. The wedding did not continue. The officiant gently announced that the ceremony would be paused, and the guests began to move, slowly at first and then faster, breaking into small groups. The journalist had stepped outside and was already on a call. Two of Henri's business partners left without speaking to him. Marcus Roche and his legal representative disappeared into a side room. Vivienne followed them. Julian found me near the side exit as I was collecting my bag from the bridal suite. He did not ask me how I was feeling, which I appreciated. He said only that he was sorry it had taken this long for the truth to have a moment. I told him I understood. He said his father had been holding something over him for years, the promise of inheriting the Roche Group, the threat of being cut out completely, and that he had not been strong enough to walk away from it alone. I told him I did not blame him for that. We were quiet for a moment. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said thank you. Not for exposing his father. He said thank you for giving me a reason to stop pretending. I nodded. We shook hands, which felt strange given the circumstances but also felt exactly right. Julian Roche left through the side door. I never saw him as a potential husband again. But for the first time since I met him, he felt like a person I could actually respect. I walked out of that estate into the late afternoon sunlight and stood beside my car for a moment, just breathing. The air was cool and smelled like cut grass. Somewhere behind me, inside that beautiful, expensive venue, Amara Osei was dealing with the thing he had spent 11 years preventing. I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me a little. I had expected to feel something sharp and clean, the way you feel when a long project finally ends. Instead, what I felt was quieter. Something closer to the sensation of setting down a weight you have carried for so long that you had almost forgotten it was there. My phone had already begun to fill with messages. My uncle. A cousin. A colleague who had watched through a livestream someone had started without permission. I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove. I thought about Thomas Acquah. I had found a contact for him through an old professional directory. I planned to reach out to him the following week. I did not know if what I had done would be enough to reopen his case formally. But the evidence existed now, publicly, in the hands of a journalist who was not going to let it go. The world knew a different version of the story than the one Henri had paid to have told. As I drove away, I understood something my father had never meant to teach me. His greatest fear had never been the scandal. The scandal he could have managed. His greatest fear had been losing control over me. And that, quietly and completely, was exactly what he had lost.